Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this conversation. I'd like to introduce myself first. My name's Hannah Storm. I'm a media consultant specialising in safety and mental health. And with me is my friend and colleague, Professor Anthony Feinstein, who is the Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto and author of multiple studies and publications, most recently his book, Moral Courage, which profiles 19 investigative journalists. Today we're going to be talking about moral courage and moral injury, and we'll begin in a moment by defining the two because they're quite complicated. But I want to take a moment to just explore how we became involved in this conversation. I think it was about 7 years ago, probably, Anthony, wasn't it? And we were working, it was during the kind of peak of the migration crisis into Europe, where we were seeing lots and lots of people fleeing devastatingly difficult situations. And we were seeing journalists kind of going and covering these stories, and they were coming back and they were quite shaken. They weren't really in physical danger, but they were quite shaken, Anthony, weren't they? And do you want to take us through in terms of how we then proceeded in that?
So the study started with trying to look at conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder and depression in this group of journalists, and I'm pleased to report that we didn't find high rates of PTSD or depression, but what we found was something called moral injury, which I'll define in a moment. And the challenge that we faced 7 years back was that there was no good way of defining moral injury amongst journalists. The military knew all about it. They've known about it for a long time. They have self-report rating scales that they developed after the war in Iraq, for example, in which you could quantify something called moral injury, but this was in a military group of individuals, and journalists were very different. So we had to borrow from the military to try and look at moral injury in a different group, and that was an inadequate way of defining the problem. And so that led to a whole new area of research.
And for the last 7 years, we've been kind of, connecting backwards and forwards across, I'm based in the UK, Anthony's in Canada, connecting backwards and forwards across the Atlantic, kind of seeing things change and this kind of conversation. There's much more awareness around the impact of journalists' work on their mental health now, as many of you know, but seeing this conversation and seeing people in situations where we feel like they might be more vulnerable to moral injury, which Anthony is now going to define, because anybody who's worked in moral injury knows quite how flipping difficult it is to define. So over to you, boss.
Okay, so first of all, moral injury is not a mental illness, and I think it's very important to stress that. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental illness. Depression is, but moral injury is not, and I hope it never becomes one. So the definition that I like for moral injury, it's a condition that can arise from witnessing or perpetrating or failing to prevent acts that transgress your moral compass. So I'll say it again, from witnessing or perpetrating or failing to prevent acts that transgress your moral compass. And the important point about this definition, it can arise from things that you do or other people do, acts of commission. So I did something that was morally wrong, or other people do things that are morally wrong. But it can also be from acts of omission, from things that you didn't do. I should have spoken out. I should have done something, but I kept quiet. And in response to that, it transgresses your own moral compass.
And just picking up on that, because of the should-ofs, would-ofs, could-ofs, we often get this real sense of kind of shame, don't we, and guilt, and
yes.
those are two of the things that are
Very
most
much.
common.
Yeah, so that the cardinal emotions associated with moral injury are shame and guilt and disgust, and in journalists, interestingly enough, anger. So, the research that we've done when we've compared our data, for example, to the military data, is you see shame and disgust because of these events transgressing moral compass, but journalists also feel a strong sense of anger.
Let's move on to, so that, if you've got moral injury on one side, Anthony's book is called Moral Courage, and it, as I said, profiles 19 extraordinary human beings, 19 investigative journalists. Give us a brief overview of how you would define moral courage.
Okay. So here I borrow from work done by an American researcher called Rushworth Kidder, who wrote a really wonderful book on moral courage. And he says you have to have 3 ingredients for moral courage. Number 1, there's the background of risk and danger. That's very important. So this work can come with consequences, negative consequences for yourself. The second thing is you've got to have your own moral compass, which people define in many different ways, but you have to have a moral compass. And the third thing is you've got to have the agency or the energy to act on your moral compass. So danger in the background, your sense of, well, this is my moral line in the sand, but then you're prepared to do something about it. If you only have 2 of the 3 ingredients, you don't have moral courage. So, for example, you can have a very strong moral compass, there can be a lot of danger in the background, but you don't do anything, then it's timidity. It doesn't translate into action. You can have a lot of action, a lot of daring do. I'm going to do a lot about it, and there can be a lot of danger, but if you don't have your moral compass, then it's just physical courage. It's not moral courage. So you have to have these 3 core ingredients to have what is called moral courage.
And we see within the book profiles of journalists from across the world, from Russia, from Mexico, from Namibia, and various other places as well. And I'm seeing in the audience here many familiar faces, many people I know who are very passionate about this issue and actually working in some pretty difficult environments as well. Why is this idea of moral courage so pertinent to journalists, and why particularly now at a time in our industry and profession when there's so many people are so under attack?
So I run a behavioral science lab, and I've done it for a long time. And one of the things that really interests me is, why do people do remarkable things? Why do people confront danger willingly, voluntarily? What motivates them to do this? And motivation is a very complex thing. There's not going to be one single variable that will define why people do dangerous things, complex things. But I do think there's a thread that links all these journalists that I spoke to, and this is moral courage. And when you look at these individuals who come from diverse countries, they all confront very difficult regimes. They pay a terrible price for doing it. They know in advance that this is not going to be easy. They know that this is going to be a difficult road for them, but they still do it.
Many of them now live in exile. Many of them have lost very close friends and colleagues. Many of them live under constant threat to their lives. When you profiled them and in many cases spoke with these people, what was the motivation that they gave you for continuing to want to do their work?
Right, so in many ways they spoke to moral courage without being aware of what the definition is. But the thread that I think linked all these journalists was they couldn't keep quiet, that the act of omission becomes so uncomfortable for them that the shame and guilt that comes with the act of omission is something that's intolerable. And they would rather have the consequences of speaking out against, for example, Erdogan or Putin. They know what's going to come. They know this is going to be rough for them. But keeping quiet comes with so much shame, so much guilt, so much anger that they feel compelled to do it. And I think, to try and understand the complexities of human behavior, you have to view it across a continuum. I mean, we all have a moral compass, I think. I mean, the only people who don't really have a moral compass are psychopaths, by the way, who make up about 6% of the population. So
maybe like one or two of you in here, yeah?
This is a select audience, so they've been screened out. But we all have a moral compass, but it lies along a continuum. So people see things going on in their society that appall them, and they'll talk about it, but they might not do anything about it. Some people might do something. They might donate to a cause. Some people might go on protest marches. You can see people prepared to do more and more things that are more active. And then at the far end of this continuum, you will have those individuals who are prepared to risk all, because what's going on is so egregious, it's so profoundly distressing to them that they feel compelled to speak out. If they don't, they have this sense of overwhelming shame or guilt. And so the journalists who I spoke to for this book are at the far end of the spectrum. They're the group of individuals who feel that the act of omission, of keeping quiet, is just is unacceptable. And they do it despite the consequences. They know what's coming.
And you speak with, within the book itself, we hear stories of journalists who have, the one chap who said goodbye to his mother and didn't see his mother for like 20 years, kind of people living in exile, people who are, Gwen Lister from Namibia, who had this moment in her very young life that suddenly changed the course of her career. Do you want to pick up on any of the kind of specific individuals?
Yeah, so where does this moral compass come from? And in some cases it's learned. It's learned from parental behavior. I think a classic example of that was the Azerbaijani journalist Ismaila, who...
Khadija Ismailova.
Yeah. Who basically, calls out the Azerbaijani regime for being corrupt, that all this enormous amount of oil revenue is not going to the people, but is going to like a clique within the country. It turns out that her father was a minister in the government, the Azerbaijani government, and he was aware of corruption and called out his colleagues for corruption and immediately lost his job. And the whole fortune of the family changed. They went from being part of this elite within Azerbaijan to suddenly dad hasn't got a job, there's no more money, mom's not working, we're in financial difficult straits, and the whole fortune of the family changed. Well, as a child, she witnessed it. As an adult, she's done exactly the same thing. She's gone and called out the government for the very same corrupt practices that were there when her father was a minister. And she's paid a terrible price for it. The government has gone after her. They put cameras in her apartment. They filmed her being intimate with her boyfriend. They posted it on a website, a pornographic website. And this is an Islamic country where they tried to shame her. When that didn't work, they came with the bogus tax charges. They put her in jail, etc. So she's paid a tremendous price for her moral compass. But what she said to me at the end of the day is, despite it all, she feels good about herself as a person. She can live with herself. Her dad went through it, and she's done it. So you can see that there's an element of learned behavior in it. A parent set a very strong example. But then you've got a journalist like Gwen Lister from Namibia, whose story I think is quite remarkable because she grew up in apartheid South Africa, and she's traveling on a bus in Cape Town. I think it was in 1966, the year the South African Prime Minister, Hendrik Verwoerd, who was the architect of apartheid, was assassinated in Parliament. So this is Gwen as a kid, traveling on a segregated bus in South Africa, and white people could sit on the ground floor. It's a double-decker bus, but black people had to go and sit on the top level. And she's 15 years of age at the time, and an elderly black woman gets on the bus carrying a lot of parcels, and Gwen instinctively gives up her seat to this woman. And this causes outrage on the bus because you're now breaking a law of apartheid, which is that black people have to go and sit upstairs. So what makes a kid like that do that? She's 15. She didn't come from a political family. There was no discussion in her family about the rights and the wrongs of apartheid. I think they were decent people, and there was a moral compass in terms of other things, but this wasn't a politicized family. So she did this instinctively as a child. And then she stuck to this moral compass throughout this remarkable life. So when she gets to university, she protests against apartheid during a rugby match, and rugby in South Africa is like a religion, and she protests then, and she goes into journalism, and she wants to make a difference. And she's in a hurry to get things done, and she realizes that in South Africa, her path to the top is going to be much slower, so she goes to neighboring Namibia. At the time, it was called Southwest Africa, which was being ruled by South Africa, and apartheid was in effect there, and she rises up through journalism there, calling out the South African government for its occupation, for suppressing SWAPO. Very, very courageous woman. She was ostracized within Namibian society. White people saw her as a traitor. If they saw her coming down the street, they would cross to the other side of the road. She ended up having to form her own news organization called The Namibian, her newspaper. The place was firebombed. She would get these calls late at night threatening her.
And a woman working in a very, very macho industry as well at the same time.
Exactly, and they went after her as a woman. And so she sticks to this throughout her career, and then comes liberation, and the South Africans leave, and she's one of the heroes of the struggle because she's part of developing a free press in Namibia. And then the SWAPO government comes to her, offering her all these rewards. And we'll give you an ambassadorship somewhere. You can choose this position that you want. And she turned it all down. She said, no, journalists can't get too close to politicians. And then SWAPO becomes distrustful of her. They're the new government. Why is this woman not accepting the spoils of war, as it were? Because she's sticking to this very strong moral compass, which is that you cannot do things that transgress your own moral beliefs.
I want to move on now, if that's okay, because I'm conscious that I'd like to leave some room for questions, and we're quite squeezed in time. I've got one final question for you before we open up to the floor. Why is, and I think you've alluded to this already, so why is moral courage such a powerful antidote to moral injury?
Because one of the causes of moral injury are acts of omission, things that you failed to do. I wish I'd spoken up. I wish I'd done something. You second guess yourself. If indeed you speak up, as these brave journalists do, they don't have that shame and guilt, or it's much less. They feel better about themselves. even though their lives are going to be a lot harder physically, even though they may not have a job, even though the government goes after them, they can look themselves in the mirror and say, I spoke up, I did the right thing, I've held true to my moral compass. That's not an easy thing to do when the price is so high. And I think that's what makes their lives so remarkable. And by the way, I think that's how civil society survives. So when you look at the countries that they work in many ways, they are the last vestiges of civil society. Everything else is gone. You know, the government has undermined the judiciary, the judges are in the pockets of politicians, the NGOs have been run out the country, the political process is corrupt, elections don't mean anything, so who's left? There's a handful of courageous journalists who call out their governments.
And I think if ever there was an argument for supporting journalism, that's probably it, right? I'm going to open the floor to questions. If you would keep it really brief in the interest of time, please, if you could just identify yourself as well, and please make it a question rather than a statement. Have we got some mics? Thank you. Janine, I'm going to take you on the front first, if that's okay, and then we've got a couple more on this side. This lady here, please.
Thank you both of you for this.
Do you want to wait a second for the mic? Sorry. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Janine DiGiovanni. I'm the Executive Director of the Reckoning Project, a war crimes unit in Ukraine. Worked with both these amazing people before. Question for both of you, and thank you, this is a great panel. The situation in Gaza. Many of us are deeply, deeply disturbed by it. And some of us are speaking out and doing the best we can, but under great threat of having our funds cut, of being censored, of many different things. So I'd like to ask you, Anthony, very practical advice, because some people come to me and say, thank you for what you're doing, but I can't do that. I work in Hollywood, or I work for Canal Plus, or I work for the German government. And you know, we are not, if we do this, our lives will be destroyed. We know what will happen. Jonathan Glazer will probably never get a film again. So practically, how do we exercise moral courage when the price is tremendously high, but yet the cost of it, the pain of watching what's happening in Gaza is, you know, unbearable?
Thank you.
So there's no easy answer to that, of course. I mean, I spoke about how moral courage is distributed along a continuum. And there are going to be people who are prepared to speak out, even though they know the consequences against themselves are going to be significant. And they're a very small group. They're a minority. For them, they're prepared to take the price. For them, it's going to be more important that they stick to their moral compass than I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to be in financial difficulty. And that's a remarkable thing to do, and the number is very, very small. Most of us, when the cost becomes too high, we step back a little. Because it's just so difficult. And so that's understandable as well. And you don't want to blame these individuals or shame them and add to their guilt, because you understand that the price can be extraordinarily high. And there's only going to be a select few people who are prepared to pay that. So I think it's very important to recognize that this lies along a continuum. It's not either or. You can still have these beliefs and these convictions, and you can perhaps express them in different ways without bringing the world down on your head and losing everything because of it. I think you have to be creative about how you do it.
Would it be collective moral injury then to the entire society?
Well, I think if you look back through history, there probably is. When you look at the Second World War, for example, look at German war guilt and things like that. Absolutely. So I think yes, that's going to be on a societal level. On an individual level, I think we have to recognize that you can't hold everyone to the same yardstick as Anna Politkovskaya, for example, because look what happens to her. She gets murdered on Putin's birthday. So you have to recognize this continuum and a spectrum.
Thank you. Thanks, Janine. And obviously, as we've shown, it's a conversation that has so much nuance. And at the moment, I think that things are so complicated and so difficult that need for nuance is even more imperative. Let's take another question. There was a hand up over here somewhere. The lady here on the second row. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Saada Nursen. I'm chief editor of One World magazine. We're based in Amsterdam, and I would like to say we practice, but we try to practice journalism for justice. in an earlier session, somebody who was talking about making impact with your productions kept emphasizing, but I'm not an activist, I'm not an activist, I'm not an activist. I think this is kind of an issue within journalism where nobody wants to be labeled an activist because that's kind of like disqualifies your neutrality. I don't believe in neutrality. We don't believe in neutrality within
Can I ask you for your question? Sorry, because
yeah,
I've only got 4 minutes left.
The question is, how do you normalize moral courage within journalism organizations? Because I think a lot of the examples you mentioned are far and few. So it's a couple of heroes within that organization that have to carry everything.
Thank you.
And I think that's an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be a discussion about moral injury. People need to understand what moral injury is. They need to understand how might you address it. People do not have to be a hero, but there can be a discussion about it. People can talk about the issues. They can start raising what needs to be done, because otherwise people just keep quiet. And that becomes these active omissions which make people feel bad. I mean, one of the things that Hannah and I found with the migration crisis was journalists were really upset about being asked to do more with less. Salaries were being cut, but the expectations of them were so high. That became a source of moral injury directed against the news organization.
And they often felt betrayed by those in charge, so they often felt let down by their managers. And I think at the moment now, as we've heard so much about the kind of impact on news and the pressures on news organizations, we have to be very much more aware of that and have that normalizing conversation. There was one final question. I think we've got time for one more question if anybody has one. Jamila? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jamila Bukai. I'm a safety trainer for journalists. My question is, if part of what can lead to moral injury is the act of witnessing something that goes against your moral compass, well, so much of what we do as journalists is to witness. So what are practical ways in terms of moral courage that we can combat the dangers faced by witnessing things that transgress our moral compass?
So once again, a complex question. We've got a very brief reductionist answer, but I think by doing the very best to tell the story to the best of your ability, and if you feel you've done that, then in many ways you're on safe territory. If you feel that you've done justice to it, you're doing well.
I remember, Anthony, you talking to me about this way back when we did this study, and it was about having pretty firm boundaries around the work that you did and didn't do. So kind of really understanding the parameters of your work as a journalist. This bearing witness aspect, what's our purpose, what's our mission, is incredibly protective for our mental health. Yes, Anthony said that moral injury is not a mental health diagnosis, but it can, if left unchecked, lead to a lot of suffering, as we've seen. I just want to flag, in the interests of the fact that we'd like to normalise conversations around mental health and well-being a lot more, the book that Anthony's written, Moral Courage. I have a book coming out next month called The Very Unsexy Mental Health and Wellbeing for Journalists, but it does what it says on the tin. And it has a chapter on moral injury, and I was really privileged to speak with 45 colleagues on the record from around the world. So please do check that out when it comes out. Any final thoughts, Anthony, from your perspective? If there's one other kind of tip you could give people to help them feel more part of this conversation, perhaps?
You know, it's such a complex topic, and we just kind of scratched the surface over here. I think if you're true to what you believe in and you feel you've done the best with a story, you're going to be on relatively safe grounds with respect to moral injury.
Mm-hmm. I'd just like to make one more comment as well. In the book that I wrote, we see a lot of journalists where they have access to protective equipment in war zones, going into those war zones with what we call flak jackets, ballistic vests, helmets. Having the emotional equivalent, an emotional flak jacket, a way of kind of putting ourselves in a position where we can prepare for some of what we're likely to be exposed to, can be incredibly beneficial as well. So I would encourage people to kind of think about not just the reactive stuff in terms of mental health, but the kind of what can we do as journalists, individuals, colleagues, and news leaders to help support people in advance. At 5:59, I'm going to call that a wrap. We are around. Hannah Storm, Anthony Feinstein. I'm incredibly grateful to all of you for being with us. Thank you. It did go fast.